And then the other thing is you have to be interested. You have to find whether it's the marketing life cycle, whether it's the sales process, the technology that you're selling. You have to be interested in those pieces because it gives you the curiosity to go and ask the question of why.
Welcome to Revenue Insights. Every week, we'll be joined by revenue leaders from some of the most successful and highest growing companies. Together, we explore how they built their revenue teams, the journeys that they've been on, and the lessons they have learned along the way. Revenue Insights is brought to you by Ebster. We're a revenue intelligence platform designed to help revenue teams to build more pipeline, close more deals, and retain more customers. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Revenue Insights this week. And this week, I'm joined by Nick Ellis, who's the Chief Information Officer and Head of Revenue Operations at InVision. Nick, great to have you join us.
Thank you for the invite. It's going to be an interesting first session of doing a podcast.
Yeah, and I'm really interested to kind of dive in because you've got an unbelievable amount of experience. Obviously, at InVision at the moment, you've been there for, I think, just over a couple of years. And then before that, working at R4 Technologies and then CA Technologies. So huge amount of experience in the tech world. So the thing that I kind of love, and so you can kind of set the scene, as you said, first podcast that you've done. So can you give us a bit of insight into what your journey has been really through those companies, through your 20 plus years of experience to get to where you are today in what's quite an interesting role, you know, combining Chief Information Officer and Head of Revenue Operations?
Yeah, sure. I suppose over time I've become a bit of a utility player. And it's good and bad, right? So I started out in development, so been running professional services teams. And in my journey at CA Technologies, where I was there for quite a while through many transformations, they provided me the opportunity to move horizontally across different groups. So product management overseas, worked in Hong Kong for a couple of years, covering the Asian market in partners, running sales teams, etc. And then, as the time when I ended up running, and I got promoted into, I should probably say, the global operations team, which was a combination of sort of sales and marketing. And I've sort of condensed 20 years into a minute there. Each of those roles was, it gives you what I would classify as context in terms of how businesses operate through a different lens, right? So when you're working for a software company, all they care about, salespeople, is effectively selling software, making sure it's successful, and then selling more software, right? When you're in the services part of the software organization, what you care about is after the salesperson has sold it, is making sure that it's running successfully so they can sell more software. And when you're in the product management team, what you care about is making sure the product is easy to implement and that it can be easily sold so it drives the sales of your product. And when you're in partners, it's about how do you make a partner successful, selling your software so they can maximize and you can maximize the revenue margin on both sides. But having done those different roles, you have a first-hand understanding of the individual personal drivers of each of those organizations. It doesn't mean you have to be great at each of those roles, and there are some things I was better at than others. But it certainly gives you a starting point when you get to the sort of global ops role of understanding the challenge of what it means to be in Hong Kong, and you're only getting and your main office is in Long Island, right? There, people in Long Island's perspective of what it means to be working in sort of an Asian market with 13 countries, with multiple time zones and different languages and everything else, cultural sort of discrepancies or differences between all of them. That's a very different market to selling into the US or into Europe. So, you become much more sympathetic to working with these teams because you can look at it through at least, you walked around in their shoes, so you can look at it through their lens. And I found that to be helpful.
Amazing. And that obviously brings you now through to where you are today at InVision. So I guess what was having spent, I think it was near to 20 odd years, like in companies before that, I guess what was the driver behind joining InVision and what is the goal that you're trying to achieve there at the moment?
Well, so CA got acquired by Broadcom, and it seemed like you always look for moments that are good switching moments, right? And being acquired by Broadcom seemed like a good switching moment. And Broadcom is an amazing company, and they were a great team to work with. But I wanted to go and work. I'd worked in a big organization. I started out in a very small organization. I wanted to go back to something which was sort of more grassroots. And it provided that option. The CIO role was kind of interesting. Having spent so much time over the years rolling out infrastructure, software, security, and so on, the role that sort of had come up there, and I knew their head of their COO was looking for somebody. So we talked, and I joined, and then opportunities sort of provided itself to actually get into the operations side as well. It's not necessarily something I say that people would sort of actively go and hire for. But what I will say about it is that because certainly in small companies, which are so heavily SaaS based these days, a lot of the technologies are very geared towards your customer facing teams. And being in both those split roles, it means that you're very, very present in the conversations in terms of what the field teams need to be successful. And I think so from a CIO perspective, I've got a good team behind me on that side. We have a good security team, good data team, and each of those sort of component pieces all funnel into supporting sort of the go-to-market and the product side. So there's a lot more synergies there than I think people fully appreciate. At the same time, my skill set probably it makes it slightly probably easier for me to go and do that than maybe some other people have worked purely in IT or purely sort of on the CIO side, or purely in the operations and field side.
And when you first joined, what were, could you give a bit of like perspective on what the revenue function really looked like at that point? And I guess I'd love to know a little bit more about some of the areas that you focused on when you first went in, and I guess some of the initial challenges that you saw.
Well, look, the revenue ops team was pretty capable. Almost probably more capable than it needed to be for the size of the organization it was. And I think that's one of the challenges that sort of organizations have in terms of different size points. At CA, we were an international company, $4 billion in revenue. We had people in Latin America, North America, Europe, and Asia. It was a relatively big team. But the complexity that we had was probably not that dissimilar to some of the things that we were trying to solve at InVision. And I think there's a nuance to all of this, which is you have to solve the problems in a simple enough way that you can impact the business, but not make it more complicated than it needs to be because you're chasing the nuance. The nuance, I think, is everybody believes that the nuance is going to give you the lift, and the reality is the nuance actually creates the drag. I may have answered that question in a roundabout way, but where we ended up with is that the team has, I would say, simplified and shrunk, and we're focusing on a core set of things that which you try to reflect what the needs of the business are.
It's really interesting that you took the approach of actually simplifying, because I know from my experience, typically, the actual maturity of the revenue operations function is either, in its very much its infancy. And what's quite interesting here is that sounds like it was almost like too complicated in a way. So what was the driver behind that?
Look, I think organizations that go through rapid growth inherently, which is what InVision had done, you tend to continue to chase sort of every bit of opportunity that sort of presents itself. And sales teams, you charge them to go and find revenue, and they are inherently artists, and they will be creative. And that's the creativity then feeds down both in terms of finance systems that get put into production, and then in terms of the way Salesforce and Marketo gets configured, or CPQ gets configured, and the number of SKUs that you then create allow all these sort of deviations. The challenge with all of that is that each of these sort of levels of, you can classify as sophistication in terms of the way that you can operate, create a onboarding challenge for every new person that you bring on board, because as your organizations sort of churn, which inherently they do, especially sort of in the market that we've had for the last 2 or 3 years, you have to equip each of the new people to go and understand all the things that you've put in place to support the business. So, it's this fine balance between providing and allowing flexibility to reflect what the business needs to be successful and grow, but not being so artistic that you create something that only a few people can effectively be successful in. And look, it's a balance, right? And there is tension there, and tension is not unhealthy when working with sort of a collaborative team. And look, InVision's sort of primary objective is all around collaboration. So one of the things we are pretty good at is sort of debating out, collaborating, and sort of solving some of these problems. But that's why we ended up sort of simplifying the environment.
Perfect. And you kind of touched on one of the analogies that I really like that you use there is around sales being an art. And actually, we had Mary Shea on last week who was saying a similar thing of like achieving that fine balance between that artistry, but also the more logical side to it as well, which is sales becoming increasingly data driven. So with that in mind, how would your approach be to actually like finding that balance? I think we can talk about sales specifically, or feel free to kind of cover the entire kind of go-to-market function. How do you find that balance between artistry, but also using data, using insights to actually empower what your reps are doing?
So let me answer it sort of this way. I think part of the challenge I think we have in the operations field is to understand what we are trying to achieve from an operations perspective, right? I mean, so if you just start with you're trying to measure the team's performance, the individual or a team, the business KPIs, there's a strategy component that you're trying to align to, and all of this comes, and the way I think about this is that this all starts with sort of what the strategic sort of element of the organization is approaching and looking at, right? There is a go-to-market sort of model they have in mind. They're trying to go and achieve certain things, go after certain customers, and that is driven by some key assumptions. I think of the ops effectively, rev ops, marketing ops, you've got development operations, you've got people operations, there's sort of multiple operations, but effectively all come together. And you're a gearbox that sits inside the organization that spans the strategic aspects of what you're trying to achieve. There's your financial assumptions, whether it be your ASP, your win rate, the number of headcounts you will have in a country. I mean, you assume that you will have 10 headcount in a specific country. Now, marketing assumes that you've got 10 headcount in a country and they create X number of leads to support that number, right? But then what happens is that somebody changes their mind, doesn't put 10 headcount, they put 3. Marketing don't necessarily know, and they carry on at 10, and then sort of the downstream impact is felt across the organization because suddenly you're not getting the results that you're looking for, and it all comes back down to an assumption that was made is now not being satisfied. So the gearbox sort of view to me is you sit in this point where you need to understand strategically what you're trying to do, the underlying assumptions in terms of what you are, how that strategy was put together, and then you go and work with effectively marketing are trying to go and do an aspect of it, whether it be expanding your existing footprint or creating new demand. Sales are trying to go and prospect into existing accounts, but which ones and how, what are you expecting from it? It all converges to a point where you have a set of opportunities, and that's your demand generation function. Then you transition into your sort of prospect processing in terms of, okay, now you're taking them through the sales life cycle. Then you land. The next question is, okay, so now you've landed, what is the process that you're then going to go and do? And, we're all moving into this sort of layer model, specifically with SaaS, where you're hoping that they're going to adopt the technology. You're hoping then, because they're so excited by what you've sort of sold them, that they're going to expand and the salesperson is going to go back in and then you're going to renew. So when I think of sort of operations and you think about that life cycle, it's all about understanding from the very first moment, what is your strategy and what are you trying to achieve? What are the assumptions that you're making? And then how do you follow that whole process from end to end? And then when assumptions are not being met or your headcount's not the same headcount as what your assumptions, those are the things that you have to start to highlight, because in theory, you're missing your number, or maybe you're achieving a number without the same number of heads but that needs to be fed back into the strategy because it's a one big engine. I'm an engineering sort of student. I look at everything as sort of a feedback system, and that's effectively what has to happen. We have to provide that information back into the system so that we can then adjust the strategy. It's not perfect. It's constantly under review, but that's kind of how I think about it.
I love the metaphor of a gearbox. I think not only am I going to steal it, but I think it might well be the title of the episode. But what and actually using that kind of metaphor, something that I kind of came across, digging into your LinkedIn, kind of in the run up to this, was a real passion, I think, for collaboration across teams. And so you talked a lot about identifying where those problems are and actually building a strategy behind it. But and perhaps you can lean on some examples. How do you actually go about not only identifying it, but then also starting to connect the dots in terms of, how is this actually supporting the business? What impact is this ultimately having on our bottom line?
I'd go one step back to your question, and in terms of sort of how sort of these teams, our teams, fit into sort of this, and it comes down to a couple of parts. One is the partnership that you have with the business, and this comes back to why I think it's important that having experiences in other roles is so incredibly useful, because your empathy for the challenge that they are going through when something's not working, because at least you can relate to what they're saying. So partnership with the individual. And then the other thing is you have to be interested. You have to find what it is, whether it's the marketing life cycle, whether it's the sales process, the technology that you're selling. You have to be interested in those pieces, because it gives you the curiosity to go and ask the question of why, and then so if you sort of have those two pieces, when you understand what you're expecting, going back to sort of a strategy and a design assumption of how your business is going to work, and things aren't working because stuff doesn't work how you plan it, right? That's the only thing that is guaranteed, is that what the plan is not what you end up with. You start to look at and you start to question where a gap is appearing, and you ask the question why. Now, once you start asking it and you've got intelligent people that you're working with that sort of know their space, and you have a good partnership, they're willing to dig in with you, and they will ask additional questions that you hadn't thought of. And now you're learning from them, which then is helpful down the road. But you also hopefully solve the problem. And you solve the problem by recognizing that something's not right in terms of both your assumption, your strategy, your execution. Haven't got the right number of people. Product may not be executing the way that you thought. The life cycle's not sort of clicking. Your messaging is not clicking. Could be a myriad of things. But unless you are willing to ask the why, and keep asking the why, and keep looking for the data and be iterative, it's very, very difficult to go and solve those things. And I think to some degree, that's some of the challenge with sort of operations, is that it can get netted down to an Excel sheet with a set of numbers on it, with pluses and minuses. And to me, that's not what it's about. That may be a vehicle that you use, or a tool that you'll use to drive the conversation. But really, these roles are about how do you aid, how do you help the person that's running sort of that aspect of the business to better understand the gap that may be appearing versus what you were expecting to actually be happening.
I love that. And it's just a bit like almost like a feedback loop in a way, right? Where you're obviously you have the data in front of you, but then also looking at it and going in terms of, okay, this is working here, this is not working here. And then we were kind of talking like beforehand around having that curiosity to go, why is that number what it is? Why isn't it going up, and why is it going down? So to some of the audience that, perhaps don't have that in place at the moment, if you were to go to a new company now and it didn't exist, how would you actually go about creating that kind of like process and procedure?
Well, okay, it all starts with the data. I mean, it's funny because every organization I've been to, and CA was sort of where it started. And our old CMO, Lauren, used to always say, if the data doesn't originate from this location, it's not the real data. Getting to a single source of truth of what the numbers are as your starting point, understanding what you're trying to achieve, what you assume things are going to go and be, back to your strategy, your plan of some type. I mean, wherever you go, you've got to go and look at what we were expecting to happen. What did we think? What was the financial plan? What were the number of headcounts we thought we'd have? And so understanding sort of that, understanding the data and then where the data comes from, and then what data is the data that everybody looks at? What does finance look at? What does marketing look at? What does sales look at? Rationalizing that, because it's surprising that each person has their own magic Excel sheet, which pulls data in a specific way, creates a whole new set of derived values to indicate different things. Look, and I'm as guilty of doing this, by the way, as anybody else is. So, I'm not a purist on this, but you have to get to a common understanding of what the data you're going to be using is versus what you thought it was going to go and be, and then you map out the end-to-end process. And the end-to-end process is I mean, it's interesting because, and I'm going to say this it dates me. In the old days, enterprise software selling was relatively straightforward, right? I mean, you go and knock on the door, you demo your software, they potentially buy it. Then with the introduction of PLG, it shifts the whole thing to a whole digital experience that extends outside of the boundaries of your sort of sales team. Marketing starts sort of with that piece. There's a product aspect that has to work well, and then it transitions into effectively maybe through some sort of, whether it be a limited trial, whether it be a sort of a scaling point that you hit an SSO limit where somebody has to go and start tying it into the back-end systems, you reach a point where it becomes enterprise transaction. Each of those pieces needs to be understood so that you can then start to look at the data that you're actually getting, understand what you thought would be happening, and then you can start to produce a set of reports that reflect the flow of the business. And look, it's not about getting this 100% right. It's about identifying where the biggest gaps are and starting with those gaps and then getting to the smaller. I mean, it's always about turning the biggest dial, right? It's not about fine tuning before you've sorted out the big dials to turn.
Amazing. You touched on a couple of bits there that I really want to grab onto and kind of take us in a slightly different direction, because you touched on like enterprise sales and also PLG there as well. I'm quite interested in your perspective on both, but let's start actually on enterprise sales. And how has the buying process there changed, in your opinion, over the past couple of years? Obviously with the pandemic, we've seen this big shift to, more digital transformation. I'm quite curious about, from where you're kind of sitting, what it's looked like and how it's shifted.
Okay, I think I'm not sure that the shift has been that significant in the last couple of years. I think if you broaden that sort of aperture to some degree, and you go and say, we've made a major shift from on-prem software to SaaS. That was the first big transition, and it changed the dynamic because the level of effort and pain that went into deploying an on-prem software, and coming from a services background, I mean, that was one of the key drivers, right? That's the way you'd make your money. It was difficult. It was difficult to, once you'd installed it, take it out again. And then SaaS came along and made it sort of easier and lighter, and you could go and get pilot projects running much more quickly. The PLG piece, and to some degree, I mean, that started out very early on sort of with SaaS solutions, because you could actually start using it. I mean, Salesforce did that to CA. I mean, we used it in one department, went and bought it sort of secretly, and then before you know it, it's running as an enterprise solution across the whole company. But PLG has become much more of a normal way of starting to certainly trial software. And if you're starting to look at, as a CIO, it's funny being a buyer and both a seller. I constantly sort of switch between those two lenses. So as a buyer, if we're going to go and look at something to buy, we will, if it's feasible, go and trial it. And if it's lightweight and easy to go and trial, absolutely, we'll start with that. And that's the PLG piece. I think the shift, I think, for us in terms of the operations sort of groups is how you think about each one of those cycle times, and in terms of what you expect. You have to ask the question is, when someone goes through a PLG motion, are you expecting them to scale on their own? Are you expecting them to scale with support? What is the level of effort? What's the ramp time? at what point do you then go in and try to engage a salesperson to follow up on that process? Do you ever engage a salesperson? Is it all just natural bleed? And each one of those things is highly contingent upon the individual product and technology and the way that it engages and the way that it will then spread inside that organization. Some technologies are ideally suited for trialing, and some tools. I mean, New Relic is a tool that we used to compete against, and it's a application performance monitoring tool. And what was clever about it versus sort of the solution that CA at the time had, CA was a product you had to go and install. It was it was a heavy lift. New Relic, they just worked with the developers. It bled into the development layer, and before you know it, hit the production layer, and basically it just became almost a sort of a default standard. And we're talking sort of a while ago now, but from a PLG motion, very, very effective. Started free. It trained up all the developers because it was an easy tool to go and use. But nowhere near as sophisticated as the product that we had at the time, but much more effective in terms of winning over that sort of that onboarding group of people, which were the developers who wanted to test their products. So when you start thinking, going back to sort of the RevOps piece, each of these motions have a different level of sort of time from a timing perspective, a different expectation, right? So PLG, how long does it take to hit a point of critical mass? What does that look like? What does the data need to show you? And at what point do you then engage with an enterprise salesperson? And if somebody does a hand raise, the question then becomes, what do you go and do? Do you push them towards the product, or do you go and engage them as an enterprise sales cycle and try to go and get them doing a landing deal? The big deals, the unicorn deals, I really think of sort of outside of really big solutions have kind of gone away. This land, adopt, expand motion is much more the play. And once again, it then becomes you as a sort of an ops person, you have to become very familiar with what are the things that you're expecting to see, and each of those stages that you can then provide to the business and say, okay, that they appear to be sort of fully engaged, they're reaching a point of capacity, it's a good opportunity to go and grow. So that's kind of how I still look at it these days. But it's evolving, right? I watched some of these PLG to the chat boards, and it's fascinating because I bring that sort of, I'm going to say it, legacy enterprise view with that sort of fascinated curiosity in terms of what do we expect to go and see happen. The key difference to me is the deal velocity is different. It's so much more predictable when you have a rep who has a sort of good pro-sales process taking you through versus a PLG where the client is going on a journey of self-discovery. Very difficult to forecast that type of new deal.
Do you think that it will always remain like that? Obviously, buyer behavior has changed like quite a lot. But do you think that's going to be the case in like the next few years as well?
I think technology that we use in business, and this is sort of looking through a buyer lens now, has to provide value more quickly. I mean, we're using a customer, careful how I phrase it, targeting to the tools. So as customers do certain behavior, we want to make sure that we reinforce that, great job. And can you go and this is the next thing you should go and learn to help them continue to see value out of the solution. So that process of getting the right data, getting it integrated to the product, and then tying it into, sort of our email system, the easier that is, the quicker that I see value, the more interested I am in putting weight behind it. So to your question, I think that the more that product companies, and InVision being one of them, get better at sort of understanding what is your point of your speed to initial value. I think it was in an article I read the other day. I think is going to become more and more critical. And the question then becomes is how do you get the enterprise functionality that big enterprises, JP Morgan Chase, for example, right? What they want, just using a random sort of organization, nothing sort of specific, but what they want in terms of sort of enterprise security, enterprise administration, sort of all those types of things is different. So their speed to value, it may be the way they judge you. Their expectation in terms of whether or not they will buy you is different because they want all those other sort of classic enterprise features as well. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges that sort of software companies have as they start to go from sort of the low, small, medium-sized business sort of, type organization who are more tolerant and more, risk comfortable effectively, or don't even worry about the risk, just don't think about it, and you go to an organization which is like a bank, they have to be very, very in tune with, because there is so much more at risk and exposure there, or could be exposed. So I think that's going to be the challenge as these technologies evolve. I know that as a software vendor, it's one of the things that we constantly look at is the balance between speed to value. What can you go and provide customers? How do you make it easy? And then second, on the back of that, from a security perspective, how do you make sure that you bring the right features that support those types of organization?
And something we've talked fairly like holistically around like, the role of product-led growth. And I'm quite interested to perhaps dig a little more into, obviously InVision, you can obviously get a free trial of the tool of that as well. So how do you integrate that into your sales process? So you've talked a lot about, I think, more holistically how businesses do it, but how are you guys doing it?
It's under constant review and debate. And I say that because I think organizations like us are always trying to tune and best align our experience to what our customers are looking for. And it's a balance between making sure that you react to the needs of the customer without being overly pushy. And that, I think, is the inherent challenge in terms of working with a PLG and enterprise sales motion.
Do you think we'll ever get to a point where it will become more like sales assisted product-led growth, or do you think there's always going to be that key role for the sales team?
It's funny that I was chatting with somebody on a channel today specific about this. Look, I think that the motion itself of PLG, because the other thing you've got to think about is that there's two aspects of PLG. One is the first part of evaluating of what the solution is and whether or not this is a fit for the problem I'm trying to solve, right? So that's step one. The second is you could almost call it enterprise PLG, which is you've now got it landed inside the organization, but how do you get it to bleed across the business? And bleed across the business is about sort of providing sort of positive impact outside of the original organization that you've engaged with. You've got one small department. Realistically, you want to engage with multiple all parts of the business. So you have to create a way of sort of getting that spread outside of that sort of initial motion. Now, in enterprise software sort of sale, what would sort of go and happen is you'd hit a paywall, and then your rep would go in and start to sort of provide. And Slack did a phenomenal job doing this, right? I mean, it's that as a PLG motion, they gave. I probably shouldn't reference the contract structure that they gave us, but let's just say that it wasn't difficult to add more people to Slack, and at the renewal time, they made it very clear that we'd added more people to Slack. This is pre-Salesforce, but it's a good motion, right? Because it's efficient, it provides value to us as the solution sort of expands inside the business. I mean, it hits all the value points that you're looking for. And from their perspective, it's efficient because they come back to you at the renewal time. So they're not trying to hit you up at each moment that you're one or two or three people over. I think the assisted piece certainly is where people are gravitating to. I think what we have to think about is that there's products which are sort of they have a single product, and then there are products which have sort of bolt-ons that go on. And I think that there is. And I was talking to a company yesterday. I won't say who it was, and they were taking us through sort of their solution. But I mentioned something, and immediately, because we now sort of hit from a usage perspective, we sort of hit this sort of semi-annual review. They've got three other things that would solve these problems, which compete with other solutions that I have. So, to me, that's the switch from, okay, we may have got it through a PLG motion, we may have extended into a landing point, and now we're being sold to as an enterprise customer because they recognize that they can go and help me consolidate my footprint. Because I'm, back into the buyer view, we have 240 SaaS apps inside our company, and we're not a big company. And so for us, all the benefits of SaaS, it becomes complicated because these are all solutions that need to go through security reviews. They need to go through integration strategies. You've got data in different places, all of this stuff, procurement, it does inherently become complicated. So if an organization can help me rationalize and I can continue to drive that number down, then I'm interested, even if the functionality is not as good as somebody else I already have. So, but that's been going on since software started. It's what makes it so interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we kind of move to, kind of wrapping up, there's one more question that I'm quite interested to know the answer to. And it's been really interesting talking about like the obviously the rise of product-led growth. And so if you had to make a prediction in the next 12 months, what do you think the biggest shift in PLG is likely to be?
That's a tough question to answer. I mean, we've looked at tools that introduce AI to the decision process. It's difficult to see the lift consistently that you would expect from using tools like that because there's so much noise inside the system. Does the introduction, as AI becomes more and more robust, the data gets cleaner? Does the tools that you're buying react better? I mean, some of the stuff that we're playing with at the moment, and this is much experimental as it is sort of scientific at this point. Does that mean that it becomes more efficient at becoming viral because it drives the right behavior? PLG is all about viral spread, and it's about getting value and usage. So the more that you can drive that, the greater the success a product will have inside the business. It all comes down to then the way that you use the data to understand what it is that the features that you're adding, what is resonating, and whether or not that is having the impact that you're looking for. So the combination, I think, of the data that you're getting from your products, the data you're getting from your users, which, by the way, is becoming big customers now are starting to become more twitchy about providing some of that data to you. So that actually makes it more tricky. And then using sort of some of these modern tool sets, which are leveraging sort of aspects of AI to go and drive maybe different recommendations in terms of what you should go and push to your user, your customer, to go and get them to continue to use your product in a specific way. I think that influences their behavior. That behavior drives spread, and the spread is what ultimately sort of bleeds into obviously growth across the organization. I think customer onboarding, the introduction of scale, customer success in terms of how that helps and drives the Pendo being embedded. Nice to use Pendo because we use Pendo, but using sort of Pendo-like tools that provide that constant prompting, but then not overwhelming. All of that stuff is the art that's taking place right now. So I think all of that coming together is what's going to sort of drive. And from the operations side is that's sort of where this sort of whole thing started. Being able to provide the understanding of what's working and what isn't, and then how that's going to impact the churn of your customers, the growth of your customers, and how that ties back to revenue, and then where your sales reps, which are inherently sort of become expensive from just a pure prospecting perspective, so you can target them to specific organizations where you can help them. You can help those organizations go on that journey by both supplying content in terms of how to use it, maybe enablement, but then obviously try to get to a contract, because that's what software companies want to go and do, is sell software. I think that is sort of is where we're all striving to get to. But it's a journey, and it's a fun journey.
Nick, that was a beautiful way of maneuvering what I appreciate was a very tough question. So thank you. Right, let's move to wrap up there. Nick, only last thing, to anyone listening that wants to connect, learn a little bit more about what you're working on, where can they find you?
LinkedIn, and then I'm based out of New York, British accent, but based out of just outside of New York, which is how our conversation started, Lee, when you said you were surprised to be speaking to a Brit when you thought I was going to be American.
Yeah, and it's great to have another Brit on the show. Nick, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, and to everyone listening, thank you for listening. We'll catch you next week. Thank you again.
Thanks, Lee.
Thanks for listening to Revenue Insights. If you want to learn more, subscribe to our newsletter and we'll deliver every episode straight to your inbox. If you have any questions, feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. Our links will be in the episode notes. See you next week.